I'm Michael Bungay-Stenya. This is Change Signal, the podcast where we cut through the blather, the BS, and the noise to find the good stuff that works in change. If you're a transformational leader and you're looking for modern change mastery, this is the place where you can grieve the parting of the old and welcome the arrival of what's new. One of the first change models I got taught is the very famous Kübler-Ross model around death and grieving. Some months ago, I came across an article that basically was an eloquent rant that said, stop using the Kübler-Ross model for change management and transformation. It just doesn't work. Now, I love it when we take down a sacred cow. And the article coalesced a feeling I'd had in my bones for a while, which is, you're right, this model just doesn't work in change and transformation. It may not even work for grief and people dying, which is the original context for it. So I'm excited to have this conversation today with the author of that article. She's an experienced change practitioner herself, Jacqueline Kappers. And we're going to be talking about Kübler-Ross, but we're really going to be talking about, well, what is grief and what is loss as people go through change. Jacqueline, welcome.
Thank you so much, Michael. I really appreciate you taking the time to have me come on and perhaps do a bit of a rant still.
Exactly. So, first of all, can you give us a quick summary about what the Kübler-Ross model is? And then we can decide whether how badly we want to kick it.
Well, I don't want to kick it because it does deserve a place of honor in the grief space and in our cultural conversation. Elizabeth Kübler-Ross published a book in 1969 called On Death and Dying. And she wanted to give doctors and caregivers a tool to better support those that had been diagnosed with a terminal illness. Now, she had interviewed people who had been diagnosed. The research was not empirical. It was entirely anecdotal. And from there, she found commonalities, and she developed a model that was strictly intended to describe the experience from diagnosis to death in terminal illness. Okay. So because it was the first time that anyone had really talked about this really uncomfortable topic, it was quickly co-opted to describe how we grieve. Right. You know, how we universally grieve. And then change practitioners got a hold of it and went, hey, we could use this to describe how people change.
Right. I mean, I did this. I did this in the 90s. I was using this to teach people how they were going through their bank merger.
That's so interesting because one of the most profound things I've heard you say, I think, was in your first episode where you said, we don't want to do change to people. We want to do change with people. Right. And by using the Kübler-Ross model or the 5 stages of human response to change model, we're actually shoehorning people into a model rather than looking at the individual.
Yeah. What are the stages of the grief curve?
Okay. So the 5 stages of grief are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Right. So it's a bell curve.
You dip down into depression and eventually you come through acceptance. So it feels, you know, that quote, for every problem, there's a solution that's neat, tidy, and wrong. This feels like that because this is neat, it's tidy, it's intuitive, there's some truth to it, but it's very linear. It's very, you do this, then you do this, then you do that.
You're not wrong. I mean, it was really easy to describe and linear and predictable. And as humans, we love predictability. Our brains love predictability. So, you know, it was just a really easy way to get people to transition through change, at least to tell them how to transition through change. Not that it actually worked. I mean, that said, for some people, it does work. For some people, it does describe their process. But for most others, you run the risk of, well, not only doing change to people by shoehorning them into a model, but creating something I call grief shaming. So when change happens and rips away predictability or attachment, your brain is already stressed because it's trying to figure out whether you're going to be eaten or not. So in organizational change, you're told often, this is the change, this is what's going to happen. So you don't actually have input into the process, but it is prescribed. And then this is what's going to happen. You're going to have to do this. You're going to have to do that. And these are all the positives. It's going to be so good.
Yay for change. Yeah.
Yay. So you're already trying to figure all of this out. But then if you're not on board right away, if you're feeling a sense of loss to the previous state, if you begin grieving and everybody else looks like they're on board, suddenly you might feel shame, right? Or people might look at you and go, what is wrong with you? Like, get on board or get out, man.
Yeah.
Or come on, it's been 2 months. How come you're not over this yet?
As Jacqueline says that, I have to confess I've actually been on both sides of this conversation. I have definitely been that person doing, in a subtle, nice, not explicitly nasty way, kind of like, hurry up, can we get over this, please? And of course, I've also been the person who's felt hurried along as I've been stuck trying to figure some stuff out myself.
And then you get the stress of the change, adapting to the change, but also the stress of shame and guilt and possible fear if you don't buy into this, but you don't really support it or you don't understand it. And you just see a significant dip in health and well-being and productivity and, engagement. And it's just not good.
So if we look at the Kübler-Ross model, and I summarize what I think you've told me about why it's not fit for purpose most of the time in terms of helping people move through organizational change. Number one, it was anecdotal evidence from people dying from a terminal disease.
Yes, who had been diagnosed.
And the experience people go through when they come to terms with their personal mortality. So there's some limitations in the way it's been created in the first place, which is anecdotal rather than empirical. It was then moved to, this isn't just about the person grieving their own death, but people grieving in general. So maybe grieving for another person. Then it got co-opted by change practitioners, me being one of them in the 90s, going, no, this is perfect. This will describe everybody going through this organizational change. So it's a model that's been less grounded in empirical results, is a little linear and non-complex, and has been shifted not once but twice out of its context. Apart from that, it's perfect.
Perfect. Except Kübler-Ross herself said, when it had been co-opted, this should not be used for this purpose. And she said that herself before her death.
Okay.
So
here we go. I want to make some sort of joke about her battling people using the Kübler-Ross model by going through the Kübler-Ross model. First of all, there was anger, then there was denial, then there was depression, finally acceptance, which is like, people are still using the model. You'll find Jacqueline on LinkedIn. She's pretty active there. Jacqueline Kappers, Kappers. And her website is bluemorphogroup.ca. So blue, morpho, MORPHO, group.ca, and you'll find some good stuff there. So do check that out. And now back to Jacqueline. So how do we deal with grief when we're faced with change?
Well, everyone has, and this comes from the thanatology space, or thanatology is the study of death and loss. Everyone has a grief fingerprint. So grief is extremely individual. Everyone will respond differently and require different things to grieve, and will take different lengths of time to do so. From that work and applying that concept to the change management space, everyone also has a change fingerprint.
Right.
So everyone will respond differently to a change. Everyone will need different things to transition through it. Everyone will take different lengths of time to do so. So, in the change space, looking at the individual changes from an N1 basis rather than this group of employees will do this and this group of employees will do that. We're really taking the time to allow employees or allow people to learn about what their brain does on change and learn what they need to do to grieve or transition, to go through that, to adapt as quickly as possible. So in terms of grief, I use it as a synonym to transitioning.
So, Jacqueline, I mean, as you say that, that rings really true, which is like our experience of change and woven into that grief is as individual as we are.
Yeah.
And yet we ask organizations to go through a change experience or a transformational experience. And I know in part some of your work is in militaries around the world as well. So these are organizations with a certain structure, a certain pace, a certain expectation. How do you scale an approach to change if you have to manage people on a, as you said, an N1 basis, which is we're all individuals?
Well, with the military space, I've been purely focused on transitioning individuals from the military to civilian world. But the same content I have applied to the transitioning of first-year students, post-secondary students from home and high school to independent living and post-secondary studies. I've also applied it to organizational change to take people through, help them transition to something new. How do you scale this? I believe that every 12-year-old should understand how their brain works on change.
Right.
So that is my grand vision in life. This is my calling for the rest of my life. In terms of the organization right now, how to deal with the transition, I think it's probably healthy to understand that the transitioning process for a human being is more like oscillation. So Strobe and Schutt, who are two, again, grief researchers out of the Netherlands in 1990, developed a model called the dual processing model. And they accurately describe the experience of transitioning through, which is like, we'll be focused on the past and then focus on the future and then focus on the past. So we'll oscillate between the two. And that can happen in like 5 seconds or 5 minutes. And sometimes it doesn't, it happens over 20 years. And when you look at this dual processing model, it's actually the Bridges model of transitioning at a 45-degree angle, which was the light bulb for me in this moment or this work. If organizational leaders understood and had compassion for the human experience of loss and transitioning and allowed people to do what they need to do to transition quickly and effectively and healthily, it would actually cost a lot less in terms of what change potentially costs in terms of turnover and disengagement and absenteeism, and actually unlock an astronomical amount of performance if we allowed our people to just honor their humanity when it comes to change.
You talk about this oscillation model, which I don't know, as kind of coming at the Bridges model from 45 degrees, which is intriguing.
Bridges is interesting because he was the first one to identify that there were two parts to a change. There's a tactical change, so the change itself, like a merger or the implementation of a new system or leaving the military. And then there's the transitioning, which is the adaptation of mindset and behaviors in order to adapt to the new state. But he was also the first to identify that every change begins with loss, with an ending, positive or negative, chosen or imposed. When change happens, you must let go of the previous state in order to transition and adapt to the new state.
Okay, that's really helpful.
So just because it's a loss doesn't mean it's a negative, and just because it's a gain doesn't mean it's a positive. But every change begins with loss.
I just want to pause on that because it feels such a deep truth and one that we so often miss or skip over. Every change begins with loss. Every change begins with loss. Michael, remember this. And when you say it comes 45 degrees to Bridges, I like that, but I don't fully understand it. Explain that for me.
Bridges' model is 3 stages.
Mm-hmm.
It begins with loss. Then you've got the messy middle, the neutral zone, where you're bouncing back and forth and you kind of get lost. And some people cross really quickly into the new normal and others get stuck in the neutral zone. And some people just keep going back and forth. That back and forthing in the neutral zone is the oscillation for Strobe and Schutt between being focused on the past and focused on the future. So when you tip it at a 45-degree angle and superimpose it on the Bridges model, you've got the same model.
Okay, got it. That's really helpful. Both kind of helping us better understand the Kübler-Ross model and where it comes from and why it doesn't really translate to organizational change so well, but also some alternatives. What haven't we talked about? What needs to be said around grief and change that's still to be said?
I think using the word grief is probably not helpful in the organization. I had the privilege of speaking to Dr. Neil Thompson, who is a grief researcher in Wales, and he's worked for decades to try to get leaders to talk about grief in the organization now from a bereavement perspective. But I took it a step further, and I have a marketing background, so I used to teach marketing for our local university. And I said to him, "Sir, it sounds like you have a marketing problem with grief." The language that we use is so important, which is why I don't tend to talk about grief.
Right.
I talk about transitioning. So I think it would be lovely if organizational leaders understood that grief is unique to each individual, that it is a fundamentally human physiological process. It's not a character flaw. If someone isn't adapting, it's not a personality weakness. It's a physiological process that involves a very normal human response by one of our most important organs. You know, our brain does this thing on change.
Yes.
And it doesn't happen to everybody all the time. For every change, everybody has a change fingerprint. Everybody has a grief fingerprint. And then took the time and the space to stop what they're doing before their next change and say, okay, let's create change capacity first.
Mm-hmm.
And then support our human beings through this so that we can facilitate the change, make it easier and less costly, but also unlock human performance related to our organization. So stop thinking about grief per se. Stop trying to shoehorn people into a model that is outdated and was never meant for organizational change. And have the courage to stop and take a step back and unlearn what you've been socialized with and shift your focus from fixing downstream to creating capacity upstream on an N1 level. It'd be a lot cheaper, that's for sure. It would be a lot healthier as a society if we did.
Well, I feel that was a twist in Jacqueline's last comment. I mean, first, know that every change begins with loss. I think that's one of the core truths in this conversation. But also she's saying don't use grief, that term, in an organizational context. That's Jacqueline's recommendation. It's too confronting and messy and personal. There's too much baggage. But still, just because you're not using grief, know that there's grief there to be processed. I love this bonus episode, and I love that you stuck around to listen to it all the way through. So thank you. If it felt helpful for you, would you consider recommending it to a friend or a colleague? That is the best way for this podcast to grow. Thanks for doing the work. I'm glad you're here.